Okay, we will start with the consent and approval of agenda. You've had the agenda in front of you. Are there any additions to the agenda? Seeing none, it's approved. I'm going to ask John Clark, since he was the chair some 6 years ago, or nearly 6 years ago, from the last time this committee meeting met. John, do you recall these minutes? Are they correct, sir?
I can't remember 6 days ago, let alone 6 years ago. So yeah, they're fine, Doug.
Is there any additions, changes, edits to the proceedings from October of 2019? Seeing none, we'll accept those as presented. Now it's time for public comment on items not on the agenda. Is there any public comment online or in person? Seeing none, we'll get to the matter at hand, which is to consider the 2025 Weakfish stock assessment updates. And with that, we'll ask Dr. Katie Drew to take over on that. Oh, I'm sorry.
I can't default on my duties of letting you all know who is online for commissioners. And I'm still, trying to get through these lists and make sure I see everybody. And I think the only person that I see is James Minor. And if I'm wrong, I'm really sorry. And Jesse Hornstein.
Very good. Thank you for that, Tony. Okay, Katie, up to you.
Great. Thank you, Chair. So I will be presenting the 2025 Weakfish Assessment Update. Our TC Chair is online but could not make it here today. So I'm going to just start out with the bottom line up front, as they like to say, which is that based on the exploration of model performance that the TC conducted, the TC is concerned that the current Bayesian model used to assess weakfish has been underestimating natural mortality in recent years. And as a result of the work that we did on this assessment, the TC does not recommend using this update for management and instead recommends completing a benchmark as soon as possible. So I'm going to now go into the data that went into this assessment and the model results, and then kind of come back to those TC recommendations and conclusions. But I did want to kind of get that on the record to start with, which is that this is going to be more of an explanation of why we do not recommend using this for management rather than a traditional assessment presentation. So today I will be talking about the 2025 assessment update inputs, which include the total removals, the catch at age, and the indices of abundance. The model results and some of the explorations we did around model performance, and then again, coming back to those TC recommendations about next steps. So starting with the input data, we, for this assessment, use recreational harvest and release mortality, commercial harvest, and commercial discards to get to total removals. For commercial discards this year, we did make a slight change to the methodology, or maybe an update to what we were doing with the methods, where we estimate from observer data a discard ratio, but rather than being a discard ratio of weakfish discards to total catch, as is done in the usual standardized bycatch reporting methodology, we use the ratio of weakfish discards to the landings of a guild of species, that is, species that are statistically more likely to have been caught with weakfish in the past, to help us identify weakfish trips better in this methodology, or to use a more representative set of landings to scale those observed data up. So we developed this discards ratio, which is observed weakfish discards divided by the guild landings on that trip from the Northeast Fisheries Science Center observer data. And then we scale those observed discard ratios up by multiplying the discard ratio by the total guild landings of those species. So we calculate this discard ratio by region, season, and year for certain regulatory periods. But we have only used in the past a single time period to determine the guilds for the benchmark and the 2019 update. We added a new block to the guild determination for this year. So for the benchmark, we used 1989 to 2014. For the update, we used 1989 to 2017. And for the 2025 update, we used 1989 to 2014, and then looked again at the species composition for 2015 to 2023 to kind of update those relationships. and to kind of capture differences in how the fishery is performing, changes in other species, et cetera, to better refine those relationships. They were generally similar between the benchmark and the 2025 update. I think probably the most notable differences was that Atlantic croaker in the northern region was no longer significantly associated with weakfish discards, likely due to the really declining levels of weakfish catch in that, or sorry, of Atlantic croaker catch in that region. And then kingfish, menhaden, and black drum became significant for some years and regions as well. This is a comparison of the discards from the 2016 benchmark, the 2019 update, and the 2025 update. And you can see that with the 2025 update, adding that new species guild did increase the estimates of discards over that period where they did overlap. But if you extend the time series using the 2019 guilds as opposed to adding a new guild, you can see that overall the scale of the estimates is very similar. They peak in slightly different years, but that increasing trend in discards is the same for both methods. So that increasing trend we're seeing in the commercial discards is not solely a function of the new guilds that we are using. So zooming in on this graph of total removals, I'm sure you're all familiar with it. You can see that back at the beginning of the time series, we started out of around 15,000 metric tons of removals in the 80s and have just declined over time. You see a little bit of a recovery in the late 90s and early 2000s, but have continued to decline after that to very low levels. And in fact, I'm going to zoom in on those last 20 years just to see them a little more closely. You can see that we have really reached a sort of a time series low around the 2010s, and then have been increasing slightly since then, and at least since the last assessment update. Some of that is the higher commercial discard estimates that we have, but there has been a slight increasing trend in some of our directed fisheries as well. So if we compare the last assessment update 2015 to 2017 with the current assessment update 2018 to 2023, you can see commercial discards and commercial landings have increased. Recreational the average over that time period. Recreational landings are slightly lower, but basically the increasing trend is still there. The recreational landings just hit their low point a little later than the commercial did. But there has been a slight increasing trend across all of these fisheries. So we also developed the catch at age using age length keys by year, region, and season to capture differences in growth across these different time periods and regions. And then we developed the length frequencies by year, season, region, and fishery. So we have commercial versus recreational landings, or sorry, length frequencies, and then by disposition. So we have landed versus released or discarded fish. So this is what the commercial catch at age looks like. We've color coded these to be before and after that coastwide size limit. And so what you can see, what I want to highlight in a lot of these graphs is you can see in both the catch at age for the fisheries and for the indices, you can see this, this brief period of recovery that we had in the late 90s and early 2000s where the age structure expands, and then it has really contracted in recent years as those landings went down, as the population declined, and that we're not seeing the same levels of catch in those older age classes that we have seen in the past. So this is the commercial catch at age. This is the recreational catch at age. Again, you can see that expansion and then the contraction of the age classes. These are the age 1+ indices we use in the assessment. We use an MRIP harvest per unit effort index, and then we have information from NEMAP. The Northeast Fisheries Science Center's albatross years, when they switched to the Bigelow, we lost all of those inshore strata, and which were where we were mainly catching the weakfish, so we don't use the Bigelow years. The New Jersey Ocean Trawl, the Delaware 30-foot trawl, CHESMAP, the North Carolina Pamlico Sounds Independent Gillnet Survey, and CMAP. And so, you know, if you look at these indices, it's kind of a mixed story of maybe there is a little bit of an increasing trend in the most recent few years in some of these indices. We have a couple of high flyer years in New Jersey and CMAP, probably driven by a strong recruitment event. But other indices just remain sort of flat and low in recent years. So kind of a mixed story in terms of the indices. If we go then to look at the age structure of the indices, so this is again the MRIP index. Again, you can see that expansion of the age structure and then the contraction in recent years. The NEMAP index starts after that second decline, if you will, but even there we're seeing fewer of the age 4 fish that we used to see in the past. The Northeast Fisheries Science Center index, the New Jersey Ocean Trawl Index. Again, these indices, most of these tend to catch more of the younger fish, ages 0 through 1 or 2. But even in the New Jersey Ocean Trawl, we were still able to catch some of those larger fish when they were available in the 90s, and we don't see them in the age structure anymore. Similarly, the Delaware Trawl Index and the CHESMAP Index. Again, this one also starts after after that peak in the 90s, but you can see that contraction in the age structure happening. And the North Carolina Independent Gillnet Survey, maybe a couple years of some older fish here, but we're talking maybe 1 or 2 years compared to earlier in the time series. And again, CMAP, the loss of those older fish in the index. Looking at the young of year indices, again, kind of maybe a mixed story. We have a composite young of year index that we developed from indices from Rhode Island all the way down to North Carolina. It looks like maybe at the northern edges, you know, Rhode Island, Connecticut, New York, maybe we have been seeing a little bit of an increase, but other indices are low or just very variable in recent years. So all of that is the input data. Let's jump into some of the model results. So for the assessment, we use a Bayesian statistical catch-at-age model that estimates a time-varying natural mortality rate. It also allows spatial heterogeneity in the indices, which means that it does not assume that the same proportion of the population is available to that index every year, which is usually not, that is the assumption that is usually made in these models, but we allow some spatial heterogeneity here. So the 2016 benchmark and the 2019 update used an upper bound of 1 on the value of natural mortality that was being estimated by this model. This seemed like a reasonable number at the time, given that the maximum age of weakfish that we've seen is 17 years. So they're not a really short-lived species, or at least they have not been in the past. And so an upper bound of 1 seemed reasonable. However, in 2020, Krause et al. Released a paper that used an integrated tagging model to estimate natural mortality for weakfish for the period of 2013 to 2017. And they estimated an M of 2.33 for age 2 to 3 weakfish. They also, which was much higher than what we were estimating, obviously, but they were estimating a similar total mortality to what we were estimating from the benchmark for this time period. So that raised the question of, is the upper bound on natural mortality in this model too low? So for this assessment update, we ran the model with 3 different bounds on natural mortality. So we used a bound of 1, which is the same as the previous assessment. We used a bound of 1.5, and then we looked at a bound of 3. We also did some sensitivity runs around data, in particular, looking at a terminal year of 2017 and an M bound of 1, that is, you know, what is the effect of adding additional years of data, and also some of the changes that we had in the indices in that earlier time period versus what is the effect of that bound on natural mortality. And then we did a sensitivity run using the 2019 guilds for the discards. So the results, what we get is when you put a higher bound on M, you get a higher estimate of natural mortality. So what I'm showing here in these graphs is the M bound of 1, which is what we used in 2019 and 2016, is this black line with the gray confidence intervals. The orangish line with the bound is the bound of 1.5, and then the blue line is the bound of 3. So what you can see is that with that bound of 1, we were really bumping up against it in these earlier years in the time series. And that when we raised the bound to 1.5, we were still bumping up against that 1.5. When we raised it to 3, we did not go as high as the 2.33 that Krause et al. Were seeing, but we're still seeing a pretty significant increase in natural mortality for these runs. And so they're all showing sort of the similar trend, right? Of you start out low in natural mortality from about the early 2000s to about 2010, there's an increasing period, and then we've been variable but stable at a high level of M for most of the recent last 10 or 15 years. The estimates of total mortality are similar across all of the runs. So this is natural mortality plus fishing mortality. And basically what's happening is the model is picking up on a consistent trend in total mortality, but when you put that bound on natural mortality, it has to put the rest of it into fishing mortality so that it can get back to the same total mortality. Those higher estimates of M translate into higher recruitment estimates, which you can see on this graph. And you'll see that it's really the divergence comes as when in the early 2000s to current times, when you get that increasing trend in M and how fast you're increasing and the height that you reach at the end. So this is recruitment. This is spawning stock biomass. We're estimating higher spawning stock biomass under the higher bounds of natural mortality. And then this is fishing mortality. And like I was saying, we're estimating lower estimates of fishing mortality with those higher M bounds because we're putting more of the total mortality into natural mortality, which means less of it is coming from fishing mortality. So if we compare kind of the scale of the 2025 update with that bound of 1, it's generally similar to the 2016 and 2019 assessment updates. So the 2016 and 2019 updates are on this figure, but they're mostly within the confidence intervals of the 2025 update with that same bound on natural mortality. When you change the bound, you change the scale of what we're seeing in the most recent few years for the model estimate. So what the TC concluded out of this was that the assumption about the upper bound of M in the model is having a significant impact on the estimate of M and the overall scale of the population. So the benchmark bound of 1 seems to be too low for this model, and the model is likely underestimating natural mortality. And this is consistent with the findings of that tag-based natural mortality from Krause et al., who were also estimating from independent sources a much higher natural mortality than our benchmark model was. So based on all of those results, the TC recommends that this update should not be used for management. Changing the upper bound on M would be a significant change to the model, and more work is really needed to evaluate the model performance, the reference point definitions, and all of that if we were to simply just raise the bound on M. It's not really something that can be done for an assessment update. It should be done through a benchmark assessment in order to have the best understanding of the impact of those changes and the final model. So we are recommending that we initiate a benchmark in 2026 to be completed and peer reviewed in 2028. We would focus for this benchmark on evaluating the ability of the model to estimate natural mortality in the current low removal scenario through additional simulation testing, as well as exploring potential other parameterizations or other model frameworks, including potentially an age varying as well as a time varying M. This would also give us an opportunity to incorporate the new MRIP numbers, which are scheduled to be released next year, as well as other issues like a reevaluation of shrimp trawl bycatch that have been research recommendations and priorities in the past. So overall, as I mentioned at the start, we do see some positive signs in the data. So for example, those increasing commercial and recreational catch, some small increases in some indices in recent years. but we're not really seeing any signs of an expanding age structure in the catch or in the indices. And the flip side is some of those indices have just been flat or variable at low levels with no real trend in recent years. So we're not seeing a consistent, strong signal from the data. The TC feels that this means that it's unlikely that stock status has changed significantly since the last assessment, and does not believe that management changes are warranted at this time based on the available data that we have. So with that, I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much, Katie. Questions for Katie? John Clark and Roy.
Thank you, Katie. It's pretty depressing news there. I mean, we've seen, you know, that tracks pretty much what we've seen in Delaware Bay. I know our both recreational and commercial catch of weakfish between 1998 and 2008 declined by 99%. But when the natural mortality was accepted as a reason that the weakfish stock was declining, there were plenty of possible reasons for that. I'm just wondering if something that could be added to the charge of the stock assessment subcommittee would be to look at some of these predators. I remember at the time thinking that maybe it was the rise of the striped bass population, but clearly that's tailed off. The one that I keep coming back to though now are dolphins and porpoises, and just wondering if those populations could be looked at in relation to weakfish, because something crazy going on there. I mean, they're just not coming back in the Delaware Bay.
Yes, so we could definitely add that. I think that would be part of our terms of reference, is to evaluate some of these causes of natural mortality. As you know, we've built weakfish into the ERP model specifically because of that concern about the striped bass and weakfish relationship. Was it predation? Was it competition for menhaden, et cetera? And that relationship has not really come out through those models. Or it's, but yes.
Yeah, if I could just follow up, because during that collapse, we were looking at condition factor of the weakfish. And of course, that's not going to prove anything, but we weren't seeing any, you know, if it was competition, it didn't seem like it was competition. They were getting plenty to eat, but they were just disappearing.
Yeah, and I think Krause et al. Do mention the potential for dolphins as a potential predator. So I think that's something we could look into. But I think we don't have a good grasp on predation data for species that could be predating on these larger weakfish, which is where the bottleneck seems to be. That we're still getting recruitment, and we do still see, you know, age ones. But you know, Krause was estimating this extremely high value for age 2 to 3 weakfish. So I think there's definitely more we can do on that front, and that can be part of our terms of reference.
Roy?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just to follow up on what John said, I had the same concerns and questions, but basically as a person who was around during the weakfish heyday of the late 70s and 80s and middle 1990s, I just keep coming back to, I hope during the benchmark stock assessment, they can examine the question of what is different now than was occurring back when this population had exploded and sustained an incredible sport and commercial fishery. Now, what's different now? Are there additional predation sources? As John said, the striped bass restoration, maybe spiny dogfish. Are there new predators, maybe mammalian predators? It sure would be nice to know why this stock continues to be depressed. Thank you.
Chris Batsovich.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and yeah, thank you for the report. It's two questions. I know we have a lot of difficulty collecting, you know, the required age and length samples along the coast under the current regulations that have been in place since 2010. You know, the 1 fish bag limit for recreational and 100-pound trip limit for commercial. Is there any concern that just collecting, you know, a representative sample of the ages out there, especially the 4+s, could be impacted by just the current management measures, because I don't, it's pretty clear that none of the commercial fleet are going to go out and really target 100 pounds of weak fish. They may get a large catch and just choose not to harvest any if they're targeting something else. And then the second question, in terms of the benchmark assessment, you lay out a proposed schedule. Should the board kind of manage your expectations with just the limitations of stock assessment capacity, and you having to run a new model? You have a schedule that could have something in place by 2028, but I think we know just with spot and croaker, for instance, it could be a little longer than that. I just wanted to ask that to make sure I'm kind of reading that right. Anyways, two unrelated questions. Appreciate it. Any info on that? Thanks.
So for sure, I think we have had to gap fill the age length key more than would be ideal. I think I know states have struggled to get to the level of sampling that is required by the FMP, and that is having an impact on the quality of the age length keys we're able to develop. People have been turning more to fishery independent samples to kind of fill those sampling requirements for ages. But the downside is, as we saw, most of those surveys are not capturing and even at the heyday, we're not capturing a lot of those older, larger fish. And so it means we're having to rely more on historical data for those oldest, largest fish. So I would certainly encourage the states to try to continue the existing sampling as much as possible, and maybe look to carcass programs or some other methods to get those larger fish if possible. But obviously there are just limitations in terms of how many fish are coming back to the dock to be able to sample that we recognize. But for sure, it's a concern and a potential source of uncertainty. In terms of the assessment schedule, I think we are entering probably a decent time on the assessment schedule where we have completed a lot of high profile assessments that were taking up a lot of ASMFC and state staff time. So going forward, we'll have a little more flexibility. If the states make weak fish a priority, I think that'll be less of an issue than we've been having with spot and croaker. Part of that with the spot and croaker is we just have not been getting, people have not been able to dedicate as much staff time to those species as would be ideal. So if that situation continues for weak fish, then yeah, exact 2028 may be overly optimistic, but we'll see where we can go on that front.
Thank you, Jason.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Katie, for the presentation. It's super interesting. Really nice job testing the sensitivity to M, kind of seeing how far you could get it to go, and good that you actually had a number that you kind of didn't just bound up against. So that was good, and that information kind of jibes with that kind of demographic bottleneck you're seeing too. So it makes sense. But one thing I wondered is, this model is at kind of like, I see it as being at the forefront of kind of what has become a transition into state space approaches. So you're allowing this one parameter, or maybe there's actually two, but you're allowing this one parameter in the model to kind of trend over time, and you're putting a prior on it and keeping it reasonable. But I wonder, that's like the only option it has to sort of soak up some of this process error that's apparently in the population. So I wondered if you guys thought about, because I didn't see that in your bullet, it seemed to me that you guys were going to stick with this model, but just sort of tinker with it. But have you thought about actually another approach, like a full state space approach?
Yeah, for sure. I think we would like to, I think we've done a lot of work with this model. It'd be great to sort of take it to the next step, and there's things we can explore with it. But I also do think there's probably limitations on what we can do on that side from a capacity and time standpoint. So I do think we're very interested in trying WHAM, for example, as a state space model or some other approach to try to capture this variability in survival or whatever those processes are going forward. So yeah.
Carrie?
Thank you. I'm new to this board and a little bit of this process, so I may be showing my ignorance. But if the stock status isn't expected to change, and we are interested to know more about what's causing the natural mortality or changes to mortality, do we really think that as a board we're going to have any tools to address the level of stock status? And if we don't expect that we're going to have any tools to address it, then is a benchmark stock assessment at this time worth the bang for the buck?
So I think we will be able to evaluate stock status through the benchmark assessment. So I think the issue right now is more about we just don't have the time or the sort of or the work we need to do is beyond the scope of an assessment update, but I think we would get new and better information from a benchmark. The flip side of that is I think we're still, all of the available evidence still points to the idea that natural mortality is what's driving the stock. So I don't think we'll come back to, hey, the stock is fully recovered in 2028, open those fisheries back up again. But maybe it can point to other things that we could be doing. For example, the shrimp trawl bycatch issue, is that still a concern that needs to be addressed? Or are there other concerns that we could address through management action versus, natural mortality as a whole? Parsing that out a little bit better might give the board more information. So, I would defer to the board on whether, or perhaps the commission as a whole in terms of what else needs work. I don't think a new benchmark, like I said, would give us, here's the lever that we can pull to bring Weakfish back. Maybe there's a few small things we could do, but from a scientific perspective, I think it's definitely worth coming back to this assessment and getting better information and a better understanding of what's driving this population.
Thank you, Joe.
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Chair. To that end, as we were sort of going into the initial phase of this being a bycatch fishery, Florida had genetic studies that looked at hybridization and were actually proportioning out their recreational catch. So I'm just wondering if any of that work has been updated. And Mr. Chair, to your home state, I always assumed that Georgia may be seeing similar issues. Now, we're not seeing, increased catch or higher catch in those states. That may just be regulation driven and not species availability driven. But just curious if there are any updates to that either Katie, you know of, or if any of the states could respond to that. And if that's information that can also be included on as we approach a benchmark on has there been updates to the hybridization, and even I would say to the misidentification of silver sea trout and sand sea trout over weakfish.
So to my knowledge, there's not been extensive work on the hybridization issue. There's obviously the Tringali paper that we do use to scale the Florida catches so that we're only including weakfish and not the hybrids. And I believe CMAP did do some genetic work looking at how much hybridization they were seeing in the CMAP samples along that coast. And there does seem to be a gradient of it sort of tapers off as you move further north away from Florida. So I think we could incorporate some of that information, but I don't believe there's been a really extensive study about the extent of that hybridization over time, and certainly not very far north.
Jason.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I wanted to jump back. I appreciated Carrie's question. It's like always good to kind of hit those first principles. Like, we could do a bunch of fancy stuff, but should we? So I appreciate the question. My response to that question, I think it's worthwhile. So I hope that we as a group support that. And one of the reasons I say that, I think there's some I think the group has some good ideas of where to kind of poke and prod and things like that. One of the other benefits of a benchmark is you can do kind of ancillary analyses as well. And so what I wanted to suggest is there was some work on winter flounders. It was Joe Langan and Jeremy Colley. They did one. This particular thing I'm talking about was done a couple of times, and it was, I think they were using PCA to look at where this demographic bottleneck, is occurring and what some of the possible culprits are. And so something like that could be a really good and not a super intensive analysis that could be done here for Weakfish as well. So there's a model there that you could, kind of emulate. And PCA was what they used. This is going back a number of years, and there's probably some machine learning techniques that could do like maybe a certainly fancier job, if not better job. So that, I think that would be really worthwhile to try and figure out, because it seems like it's, usually we just think, oh, it's a recruitment issue. So it's the very earliest parts of the life history, but this seems like it's somewhere else, which is more challenging to figure out. I think that's worthwhile and could, kind of shine some light on where the problems are in this fishery so that we could try to find solutions. Thanks.
Chris Batsevich.
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Chair. Just kind of added on to Jay's support for our benchmark assessment. I think it's time to take a fresh look at this among the other things that people are interested in looking at. And I know we'll probably get another shot at this when we go this route and have terms of reference, but it'd be interesting to see just how much mixing there is with the coastwide population of weakfish. We assume a unit stock from southern New England down to Florida, but the abundance of weakfish really varies along the coast, where Delaware Bay still isn't seeing any weakfish, while North Carolina in certain places they can be everywhere at times, multiple age groups, maybe not the old fish, but still kind of the historic size range of what we would typically see in our state. So just get a better understanding. I don't think anyone's expecting a major change in stock status from a benchmark, but just try to figure out what's going on with the species compared to what we thought was going on over the last 15 years or so. Thanks.
Any other questions or comments from around the table? We have one waiting online, public comment. Okay, then I would ask for Mr. Desmond Kahn online. He has public comment, and please limit your comment to 2 minutes.
You should be able to unmute Des. There you go. Des, if you're speaking, we cannot hear you. Des, I would just suggest under your audio settings, making sure you have the correct microphone chosen. We still can't hear you. Des, why don't you double check your audio connection, and we will go on to the next agenda item and let you try one more time. That's okay, Mr. Chair.
Yes, ma'am. John Clark.
Do we need a motion to do a benchmark assessment?
So I have it under good authority that we don't need a motion, but general agreement from the group that a benchmark is in order. I see shaky nodding of head, so yes, there we go, direction. Okay, and we still don't have Des, so we'll move on to the next agenda item. Before we adjourn, we'll try one more time. So thank you guys for that great discussion. Next agenda item is the election of a vice chair for this illustrious group. I see Spud Woodward.
Thank you. It's my pleasure to nominate from the Sunshine State Erica Burgess as vice chair of the Weakfish Management Board.
And is there a second? Thank you. Any discussion? Anybody want to run against her? Seeing none. Any objections to Erica being the vice chair? Seeing none. Congratulations, ma'am. One more time for Desmond.
Give it a go, Des. You're unmuted on our end.
Okay, well, Mr. Khan, thank you for your attempt. But if you'd like to put in written comment and send it in, that would be more than welcome. No other business to come before. This committee is adjourned.